Okay, so in this second module, what we're going to be looking at are the key roles of directors and boards. You'll remember in Module 1, one of the things that we said about corporate governance was that you can actually find the term being used in terms of different levels of analysis, 3 levels of analysis. A system of corporate governance, like Australia's corporate governance system, the governance system of a company, like BHP or any other company for that matter, QUT's corporate governance system, and then how an individual needs to behave like in that organisational's governance system in a national system of corporate governance. So what we're doing here is dealing with 2 levels of this analysis. If we're in Australia's corporate governance system, what do directors have to do? Directors and officers, the individuals in that specific system. And then secondly, what does the board have to do? And then what's the difference? Like, what's the difference between what the individuals have to do and what the group has to do? That's what today's all about, those core things that we need to concentrate on if we're going to get governance right in the companies that we lead. And really that's what this slide is trying to set out. The first thing it's trying to set out is we're going to look at the individual level of analysis, what people have to do in terms of corporate governance in Australia. So we need to know who can actually be director, how do you get to be a director, and then what do they have to do? What legal duties do they owe? And we're going to break it into 3. Fiduciary, and perhaps a better term here is self-dealing. So there's a number of provisions that prohibit self-dealing by directors. Then there's a second area of due care and diligence, which is about paying attention to what's going on in the company. That's part of what you have to do, not be negligent. And then the third thing, everything else, and we'll get on to that. Later on in Module 4, you'll see that we cover this issue of solvency, and I've actually kind of positioned it conceptually as a subset of due care and diligence because it is about paying attention, but it warrants its own treatment, which we will get to in Module 4. So if you think about what we're going to cover, it's going to be how do you get to be a director, what duty do you owe and who do you owe it to, and then what are the key generic duties that we owe. There's these prohibitions on self-dealing, due care, and then everything else. In terms of the group or the board, I want to go through the evolution of corporate governance over history because really that shows how the role of the board has actually changed. And then we're going to deal with like 2 broad issues. 1, what does the law say a board needs to do? And number 2, what commercially or in real life do boards tend to do? And out of those 2 things, we can come up with what we've labelled here a role set or a kind of generic set of terms that may cover what boards do. So that's the agenda that we have for this little set of modules. Why don't we get into the first one, these legal duties of directors, the core legal duties of directors. So our starting point is to go back and think a little bit about business law, right? Because what set us up in business law was this idea of the company being a separate legal entity. It's a separate person under the law. So the question becomes, well, then who's actually making decisions, right? Because you've got this person, and the problem of limited liability is if people aren't accountable for decisions, then they can make some pretty nasty decisions, right? Because they get all of the benefit of those decisions and none of the drawbacks because it would be on this hypothetical, mythical, legal person that would bear the brunt of the problems. So the way the law overcomes that is it holds specific natural people, right? You and I, individuals, it holds natural people responsible for certain elements of the decision making. And so we've got to go back and understand who's responsible for what in a company. And what this slide gives us is an insight into how most companies are set up and why the law works the way it does. So to reiterate, we've got that the company is a separate legal person, right? But we can't really hold this legal fiction accountable for what it does. We need to be able to hold individuals accountable. But we've got limited liability for the shareholders. You know, that's one of the main advantages of a company and why we have the corporate form, and in fact has fueled a lot of the success of our modern economies and why we've been able to develop the way that we have. In fact, it's been said that limited liability was as important to the world as the steam engine and electricity combined in terms of the economic activity that it's allowed and the generation of wealth that it's allowed us to accumulate. Okay, so we've got these advantages of limited liability for the shareholders, but the disadvantage is that maybe someone wouldn't be held to account. So we can't hold the shareholders accountable for what the company does because of this limited liability. Instead, we need to think about who we can hold to account. Now, if we look at most companies, we find that in their constitution, right, the constitution, you'll remember, is the rule book that the company has. It's actually technically a statutory contract, okay, between the parties. So it's a kind of contract that says this is how we're going to run the company. That's what the Constitution is. In most constitutions, they have this term, right? Super, super important. The business of the company is to be managed by or under the direction of the directors. Notice, it's a plural, right? A director is not in charge. It's the directors. So the group has authority, not any individual. It doesn't mention management, right? So technically, the group of directors is the one with the power in a company. They then delegate that to management. That's how power operates. Now, look, what's a replaceable rule? Okay, if you don't remember, the Corporations Act has a set of replaceable rules within it. They are the rules of how to run a company, what would be a stock standard constitution, right? And if you don't have a constitution for your company, if you don't actually need to have a physical document, you don't need to construct your own constitution for a company these days. Instead, what happens is the law deems or the law expects or the law assumes that you have put in place, that you have agreed to these replaceable rules. They're the rules on how to run the company, but you can replace them if you don't want to do it that way. Okay? So replaceable rule section 198A says the business of the company is to be managed by or under the direction of the directors. That's why directors are so accountable and so powerful, because of this agreement about how we will run the company. So we've worked out why we have directors, how we hold them to account, and why they're accountable because of this replaceable rule or the agreement in the Constitution, which we generally have in place. Then we got to go, well, who actually is a director? Now, it's pretty obvious that people who are validly appointed, so that would be appointed as per the rules of the Constitution, that would be, that they would be directors. But there are other kinds of people who might be held to be directors. So why don't we have a look at that? Okay, now I've got here that in most cases, a director is someone who's validly appointed. Yes, there are some times when you can't be a director. So, for instance, if you're an undischarged bankrupt, if you've been disqualified by ASIC, you can't be a director. I think if you're in jail, you can't be a director. So there are some exceptions, but in general, if you're validly appointed, there are no qualifications to be a director, for instance. You can just be validly appointed. And there are good reasons for that we could go into in a discussion if you wanted to, but a bit beyond what we're talking about here. There are policy issues. However, sometimes you might not be validly appointed and you still might be a director. When? Okay, Section 9 of the Corporations Act sets out that you are a director if you're validly appointed if you act as if you're a director. Now, I don't know why you'd want to do this, but imagine you walk around pretending to be a director of BHP. In fact, you're so good at pretending it that people would realistically believe you're a director of BHP. If you did that, the law would treat you as though you are a director of BHP. A way you can think about that, if you want to, is to go back to business law and think about that issue of ostensible authority, right? When you act as though you have power, then if a reasonable person might think that you had the power, you'll be held accountable for it, okay? So that's really what's going on there. So you can act as though you're a director, you'll be a director. This is a really interesting one where you control the appointed director. So you're not pretending to be a director, but you're actually telling them what to do, a shadow director. So this would be the case, for instance, I don't know, perhaps if you were a mining magnate and you had maybe a family member, a niece or a nephew who was the chief executive of the company, and you would send emails to your nephew who would do what you said in those emails, right? So what you're really doing is you are actually directing the company through a puppet, for want of a better term. You're in the shadows being a director. If you do that, if you're exercising control, you will be a director, okay? So you can't get out of the liability of being a director by appointing someone else and then telling them what to do. That's what this provision overcomes. You can also be a director if you're an alternate director. That means you turn up when the regular director can't. We won't bother with that in detail. The main ones for us to think about are if you act as if you're a director and this idea of a shadow director, because that does actually come up in practice quite a deal.